opening of Parsha Shmois, Pasuk Ches. The Pasuk says, Vayokom melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yodas Yosef. A new king who did not know Yosef arose on Egypt. Vayomer el Amai, he tells his nation, Hine am bnei Yisrael rav atzum mimenu. The nation of the children of Israel is great and stronger than us. Hava nischak maloi. Let us be sly and clever with this people. Pen yirbe, he may increase. The people, the nation may grow. V'haya kisikrena milchama. And if a war occurs, v'noisav gamhu al seinenu, this people too will join our foes, our enemies, v'nilcham banu, and will fight us v'olam min haaretz and drive us out of our own country. And thus begins the sad and tragic story of Galus Mitzrayim, the horrific subjugation of the Bnei Yisrael, of the children of Israel under the Pharaoh in Mitzrayim. Zog de Gemara, Mesechta Eruvin Daf Nun Gimel Amid Aleph. The Gemara explains this pasuk. The same Gemara is also elsewhere, Mesechta Soita Daf Yud Aleph, and also in Medrash Rabbi and Shmuel. Those are the three sources where the Chazal all bring the same argument. Vayokom melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yodas Yosef. A new king arose on Egypt, somebody who did not know Yosef. Says the Gemara, Rav and Shmuel. There's a debate between two of the sages, Rav and Shmuel. What's the problem? What's the debate? Chad Amar, one says chadash mamash. Melech chadash means literally a new king. A new king, a new leader arose and took over on Mitzrayim, became the new monarch of Mitzrayim. The other view is it's not literally a new king, it's just he changed his attitude. He created new decrees. Melech Chadash in the sense, suddenly there was a new personality, somebody we didn't recognize before. A new king, a new style of leadership, new decrees, new edicts, which were unrecognizable before. So the Gemara now is trying to understand, why would they argue? It says, Vayokom melech chadash means a new king. So the Gemara explains, just to argue for the sake of arguing. It says melech chadash is a new king. So the Gemara says, Man di amar chadash mamish. The view that says that it was literally a new king, a new monarch. The old one died, or was dethroned, probably died, and a new one took over. The ksiv chadash. His proof is quite simple. It says, Vayokom melech chadash. Chadash in Lashon Kodesh in Hebrew means chadash. It means no, it's a new king, a new king who wasn't there before. The one who says it wasn't a new king. It was just somebody who changed, he renewed, he created new decrees, new edicts. Something was bothering him. Usually the terminology in Tanakh when a new king arises is Vayimloich melech chadash al Mitzrayim. A new king started to reign. Vayimloch. You have in Parshas Vayishlach at the end the whole list. Vayamas vayimloch, vayamas vayimloch, vayamas vayimloch. Doesn't say that here. It says Vayokom melech chadash. Doesn't say Vayimloich melech chadash. Or as the pasuk, the Gemara puts it, Vayamas vayimloch. One died and a new king took over. Vayokom melech chadash, he says, is a strange term, and really what the pasuk is trying to say is it wasn't a new king. It's just Vayokom melech chadash. This king stood up, he arose, he developed a whole new attitude, a whole new philosophy, a whole new perspective on the Jewish people. He wasn't a new king. Frag the Gemara, 1 second. It says that it was a new king who did not know Yosef. If it was the same good old, I shouldn't say good old, but if it was the same old king who appointed Yosef as prime minister of Egypt, who was saved by Yosef HaTzaddiks, his whole empire was saved, who invited the Jewish people into his region, into his country. How do you say, Asher lo yodas Yosef? If it was literally a new king, it was a new guy on the block, he never knew Yosef. Yosef passed away, maybe he was alive, he never knew Yosef. But if it's the old king, how do you say Asher lo yodas Yosef? And for the Gemara, Maya Asher lo yodas Yosef, according to this opinion, it means the Havedami command lo yada le Yosef klal. It looked like as though he never knew Yosef. In other words, the way he behaved, it seemed like he would have never known Yosef. Such a lack of gratitude, such a lack of appreciation, such an absence of menschlichkeit, of simple, the feeling of human reciprocity after what Yosef did. He made believe he never knew Yosef. You know, they say the word we say in one of the al-chetz shechatanu lefanecha beyoidim ubelo yoidim. For the sin that we did, beyoidim, that we knew, ubelo yoidim, that we didn't know. The question is, it already says, we say al-chetz shechatanu lefanecha b'shoigig, b'shgaga, b'zodin. So there's a taich, al-chetz shechatanu lefanecha beyoidim, for the sin that we did for you, beyoidim ubelo yoidim. Wir haben gewusst, aber man sich gemacht nicht wissendig. Beyoidim, you know, below yoidim, you make believe you don't know. I once asked a Yid, was machst du? He said, ich mach sich nicht wissendig. So, it's sich gemacht nicht wissendig. He knew, it's sich gemacht lo yada. It looked like he never knew Yosef. That's how he behaved. I want to ask a simple question. Why do they have to argue? So he has a proof because it says Chadash. He has a proof because it doesn't say Vayimlach. But what is it that caused Rav to embrace this opinion and Shmuel to embrace this opinion? Now, very often you're having Gemara, I should say, to put it in context. The Gemara says, Chad Amar this, Chad Amar this. Rav or Shmuel. One says this, one says this. But who said which? Who said which? So there's a Radvaz, commentator on the Rambam and Hilchis Meiser Sheni, I think it is, who says that usually the klal is the name who's mentioned first, so the Chad Amar follows him, which would mean in this case, it says Rav or Shmuel, one says this, one says this. Usually, that's the common way to understand it. Others argue, Reb Reuven Margolius, as a Sefer Shem Olam, he has a different view, although probably many of his questions could be answered, but this is naturally what it seems. This is what Radvaz explains. In this case, it would mean, Rav says it was a new king. Shmuel says it wasn't a new king, it was just a change of attitude. But I want to understand, why does he go this way, and why does he follow this view? Each one had a question that bothered them. Rav was perturbed by the word Chadash. Don't tell me it wasn't a new king. It was a new king, it says Chadash. Why didn't that bother Shmuel? It should have bothered Shmuel. On the other hand, Shmuel is bothered by the Vayakam. Doesn't say Vayimlach. So they both have something that works and something that is problematic. Yet Rav chose this path and Shmuel chose this path. We want to try to understand, is there a way of knowing why Rav embraces this derech and Shmuel embraces this derech? There's obviously two ways of explaining it. Each one has a difficulty, and each one gives us some explanation and insight. What is the underlying plot, so to speak, behind their argument? Let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi on Chumash quotes the Gemara in Eruvin and Saita. Sagt Rashi, Vayakam melech Chadash, Rav u'Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel argue, quoting the Gemara, Chad Amar Chadash Mamish, Chad Amar Sheneschatchu Gzeirosav. One says literally new, one says the Gzeiros, the decrees were new. Asher lo yada, continues Rashi, Asa atzmai ke'ilu lo yada. This is a new Rashi. He made believe he did not know. That's Rashi. When we read this Rashi and we study it well, we are perturbed by something. Rashi's Pirush on Chumash, Rashi is called Rabban Shal Yisrael. He is the great commentator on Chumash. And many of his comments, most of his comments are taken from the Chazal. They're taken from Gemara and from all of the Midrashim. Yet, in most places, Rashi does not quote the Manda Omar, the person who said it, either in Gemara or in Medrash. There's approximately, I think, 130 places in Chumash that Rashi quotes a name. Most places he will not quote a name. Sometimes he'll say Rabbi Seinu Darshu. Sometimes he won't even say our rabbi said. He'll just say the pshat of the pasuk. You'll look it up, you'll see who said it. But there are some places, a little more than 100, that Rashi does quote a name. This is one of them, Rav or Shmuel. Whenever you see, Rashi was a great medayik, when you see that in most places he doesn't quote a name. In some places he does. He does tell us who is the author of this statement or the author of this argument. It means there was a reason he felt that you had to know the name. Now Rashi generally writes in Bereshis and a few times that there's many midrashim on the pasuk. Ani loy basi lefarish el pshuta shel mikra. That's his famous term about himself. My role, my mission statement is not to give you all the midrashim, all the explanations. There's many different explanations. I am here to explain. I speak to the ben chamish lemikra. I speak to the brilliant child. The child is always the brilliant, the 5-year-old who gets it. And I'm trying to explain the literal interpretation of the pasuk. That's why the names is not relevant. I'm not here to give you an encyclopedia of midrashim. There's other svarim for that, other commentators for that. Where he does say the name, it means he feels it's necessary, somehow understanding it. But if this is true, concerning all of Rashi, when you study Rashi, it becomes dramatically true in this particular pasuk. Why does it become so dramatically true in this particular pasuk? Because I want to show you another 2 Rashis, one in Parshas Vayeshev, one in Parshas Vayera, where there's also an argument of Rav and Shmuel in Gemara. And Rashi quotes the argument like he does here, and also with the names. Take a look. Parshas Vayeshev. Vayi kayoy mazeh vayovei abayis elasus malachti ve'ein ish me'anshe abayis sham babayis. It was one day, the day, and Yosef comes home to the house of his master Potiphar in Egypt to do his work. Nobody in the house is there. Lasois malachta, he comes home to do his work, and we all know the continuation of the story. Potiphar's wife is there. She grabs vatispeseyo bebigdoi. She grabs Yosef by his cloak. She says, "Shichveimi, lay with me." Vayonos vayetze hachutza. He runs out, and she tears off part of his cloak, which she uses as evidence that he tried to do the unthinkable and has him arrested. We all know the story. The rest is history. Vayovei habayis lasas malachtoi zok Rashi lasas malachtoi, and this is a quote from Masechta Soita Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis. Rav and Shmuel argue Chad Amar malachtoi mamash. One says, what does malachtoi mean? Malachtoi mamash, work. Yosef came home to do his work. What type of work? Whatever labor he was involved in. He was in charge in the home. The Chad Amar, the other one says lasas trochav nichnas. He actually came home to do his needs, as Rashi explains, to fulfill her desires. Which, this was the purpose of Yosef coming home. Finally, after such a long time, so many pleas, and so many threats, and so many requests, etc., Yosef HaTzadik surrendered. So then what happens? It's just that at the last moment, he saw the image of Yaakov, his father, etc., as the Gemara says there, and Yaakov spoke to Yosef in this image, and as a result, Yosef abstained and he fled the home. So here again, we have a machloikas between Rav and Shmuel. It says malachta, he came home to do work. The first one, Rav says, literally work. Shmuel says, doesn't mean literally work. It's actually a euphemism for Yosef surrendering to her wishes. There's another Rashi in Parshas Vayera. Vayita Eshel Bever Shava, Vayikru Sham B'Shem Hashem Keiloila. Avram Avinu planted a garden in Be'er Sheva, and that's where he called out in the name of Hashem, the God of the world. He publicized the awareness of Hashem. So Rashi, Eshel. What's Eshel? Vayita Eshel. I said a garden, but is that what Eshel means? Rav Shmuel. Chad Amar, one says, Pardis lahavi mimenu peiris la'erchim besuda. It was an orchard that he planted, where fruits would grow, and he could bring from this garden fruits to his guests at the meal. So that's the connection to Vayikra Sham B'Shem Hashem Keiloilam. Guests came, and he had wonderful, delicious, fresh fruits that he gave to them. The other opinion says no. Pundik la'achsanyu boy kol minei peiros. Vayita Eshel means Avram Avinu built, he planted a hotel, a pundik. It was a Motel 6, or perhaps a Hilton. I'm not sure. But he built a hotel, uboy kol minei peiros, and in the hotel there were all types of fruits from this garden, from many other gardens. Umatzinu lashon etiyah ba'halim shenemar vayita ole apadnai. It says vayita, he planted. If it's a hotel, you don't plant a hotel, you plant trees. So he says we find in the Tanakh, in the Niyel Perek Yud Aleph, the concept, the term planting, even when it comes to a tent. Because it means, so to speak, he etched, he established, he created his pundik, his hotel, his tent. So in these 3 places, Vayakam Melech Chadash, Vayavei Habayis Elasus Malachta, Vayita Eshel Bever Shava, in all of them we know from Rashi and Chumash there's an argument between Rav and Shmuel, what the meaning is. Does Eshel mean a garden, an orchard, or does Eshel mean a hotel, a pundik? Does Malachte mean literally his work, or does Malachte mean he actually was about to engage her? And Melech Chodesh, does it mean a new king, or does it mean just a new style of leadership? What is so strange about this, and where we see that Rashi had a shitta here, Rashi had a philosophy which just demonstrates what I was saying earlier, is this. In Parshas Chayesara, Avram Avinu goes to purchase from Ephron the Ma'aras HaMachpelah. So Rashi says, why is it called Ma'aras HaMachpelah? So he says there's an argument. One opinion is it's called Ma'aras HaMachpelah because there was a bayis v'aliyah al gabav. It was basically 2 floors. Another opinion is no, shekfula bezugos. The caves were made for peers, for couples, for 4 couples. Shekfula bezugos. That's what Rashi says. 2 opinions. Where did he get these 2 opinions? The same Gemara in Eruvin, Rav and Shmuel. Here there's no mention of the name. It's not relevant to you. The same Gemara in Eruvin that he quotes here, Melech Chodesh. Here it's with the name. There it's not with the name. Weiter. There's the same argument in Eruvin between Rav and Shmuel about Nimrod and Amraphel. There were 2 people associated, in Chazal they're seen as the same person, Nimrod and Amraphel. The argument between Rav and Shmuel is what was his authentic name? Was his authentic name Nimrod? And he was called Amraphel because Hippil, he told Avram to go in, he cast Avram into the furnace, the fiery furnace. Or no, his natural name, his birth name that they gave him was Amraphel. Then Nimrod was the nickname because Himrid ha'olam neged HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He caused rebellion, mutiny of the world against Hashem. Same Gemara and Eruvin, the same 2 people, Rav and Shmuel, argue about it. Rashi brings the view, Rashi explains what Nimrod is, according to this view. Rashi also explains Amraphel is according to this view, and there's no name. He doesn't mention Rav and Shmuel. The question is even stronger. The argument by Eshel between Rav and Shmuel is in Gemara, in Masechta Soita Daf Yud, but not with Rav and Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. One says Eshel means a garden. One says Eshel means a hotel. So Rashi found probably a version, a girsa, and a medrash, where it says Rav and Shmuel. But in our medrash, in our Gemara insight, it's not even Rav and Shmuel. So Rashi actually accepts a less popular version because he wants the name Rav or Shmuel in this place. So now we could clearly see that when Rashi quotes a name, it's not just, there's a name, I'll quote it. First of all, it's proven clearly from the fact that in most Rashis, he will not quote the name. You have to look it up yourself. Only, as I said, in around 130 places does he quote a name, and you always have to understand why. He feels that you need to know the name. But here, it becomes dramatically clear. It's the same Gemara. You bring other arguments from the same Gemara in Eruvin, because Rav and Shmuel have a bunch of arguments here in the Gemara. And yet, in 3 places you bring the name. In other places you don't bring the name. 2 places you don't bring the name. So, we're going to explore today one mahalach, one perspective in this, Be'ezer Hashem. It's a mahalach, it's a derech that was shared by the Rebbe, by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, once at a Fabrengen, Shabbos Shmois Tovshel Lamed Vav, 1976, in one of his famous Rashi Sichos, in which he analyzed and explored in detail the derech, the mahalach, the shitta of Rashi in Torah and every word in the diuk of Rashi. So although there's a long discussion there that goes over into another sugya about Rav and Shmuel, but I want to focus on one, I'm gleaning out, I'm extracting one component of a long shmuz, of a long talk that's directly relevant to this. When we learn Shas, or we learn Medrash, we come across constantly we often come across the same great sages arguing. Whether it's Abaya and Rava, whether it's Rav and Shmuel, whether it's Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef, whether it's Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel, whether it's Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, whether it's Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and it's hundreds of arguments between some of them, dozens of arguments between others. We can assume that each argument is completely self-contained. They're discussing this halacha, they have an argument. They're discussing another halacha, they have another argument. Yet, when one looks deeper, we can often find what the Gemara calls l'tamei or l'shitase, meaning there's a common thread that pervades maybe not all of the arguments, but many of the arguments. In other words, you can trace back distinct arguments to a general theme, philosophical, theological, psychological, spiritual, legal, or a particular shitta in life. And from this core argument, branch out many different details. And even though at first glance they may not seem connected, but when you get the nekuda, when you trace it back to the core, you can often see how many arguments are like branches of one tree, which of course gives a new depth of learning because it demonstrates it's not just, we always have to argue. So I hold this, you hold this. Why do I hold this and you hold this? Rather, we see that there's real central ideas of how they saw what Yiddishkeit is, what Torah is, what halacha is. And now their arguments express that. Ki chachmaschem uvenaschem le'enei kol ha'amim means that every nekuda of Torah has tremendous wisdom. It's not just, I understand, okay, he says this, he says this. If you glean, if you go into it, you'll be able to find there Yesoides HaChayim, fundamentals in life, even though it seems like it's an individual argument about an individual topic in life. There were those in later generations, Acharonim, who really focused on this, developed it a lot, particularly Rabbi Yosef Engel, the Rogatchover Gon, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and a few others, Reb Shlomo Yosef Zevin, in a few places, who really focused a lot on the shitta of l'shitase. And in their svarim, you have many different l'shitases, which are fascinating. So I'm going to explore with you today a l'shitase, a view of Rav and Shmuel, that the Rebbe suggested. There is another l'shitase of Rav and Shmuel that he explained, and another l'shitase of Rav and Shmuel that Reb Reuven Margolis, who also was into l'shitase as a sefer Shem Olam, that he explains in Rav and Shmuel. But I'm not discussing that. That's a big machlokes. If Rav follows always the literal, Rav usually follows the literal interpretation of the word, and Shmuel follows context. Shmuel looks at context, toichin ha'inyan, and Rav follows the literal interpretation of the word. That you see in many, many machlokes and in Shas. But today we want to focus on another possible ishitase between Rav and Shmuel. And for this, we have to learn a line in Gemara, B'choros daf mem tesamid beis. Zog the Gemara in B'choros, Kaimalon, we have a halach, the cholheche de pligi Rav or Shmuel. Whenever there's an argument between Rav and Shmuel, hilchese ke Rav be'isura v'chishmuel bedinah. The halacha follows Rav when it comes to Isura and Shmuel when it comes to Dinah. Isura means all issues between man and Hashem. For example, Hilchas Tefillin, Hilchas Mezuzah, Hilchas Sefer Torah, Hilchas Shabbos, Hilchas Yom Tov, Hilchas Mikvah. These are Hilchas Lulav, etc. These are halachas between Isurim, Hilchas Kashrus, Hilchas Shchita, all the dinim of kosher food, etc. Mamoina, dinner is monetary issues. Choshen Mishpat, Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, Baba Basra. Civil law, relationships between people. When it comes to Isurim, questions, is it kosher? Is it treif? Is it mutter? Is it asur? Whether in kashrus or Shabbos or tzitzis or mikveh, etc., the halacha follows Rav. All issues that are monetary issues, monetary debates, civil law, there the halacha follows Shmuel. Hilchas kerav be'isura, uchishmuel bedina, or as it's quoted at some places, uchishmuel b'mamoina. Why? Why is this? Now, Rav and Shmuel were contemporaries. Rav was older than Shmuel, but they lived in the same generation. They were born in the 2nd century after the Common Era, meaning a little more than 100 years after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, to the point that Shmuel is the first generation of Amoraim. Rav and Shmuel are the bridge between the generation of Tanoim and the generation of Amoraim, to the point that the Gemara says, Rav Tanahu Upolik. Rav is still, so to speak, the last one who could still be considered a Tana and can argue with Tanoim, even though Amoraim usually never found a justification to argue with Tanoim. Shmuel is considered the first generation of Amoraim. They were both born in the Holy Land in Eretz Yisrael, already under Roman rule, Roman oppression. As I said, it's the 2nd century after the Common Era. And they both, Rav is a Talmud of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, the editor of Mishnayos. Rav learns under Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. The Rashbam writes, in Baba Basra, that what Rabbi was in Eretz Yisrael, Rav became in Babylonia. He's called Rabbi with a Yud. He's called Rav without a Yud. His name wasn't Rav. His name was Abba. Reb Abba Aricha, they called him. Abba the long one, probably because of his height, although it's not so clear, but probably Abba Aricha. But as respect, they named him Rav, the Rabbi of Klal Yisrael, like Rabbi is the Rebbe of Klal Yisrael, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Rav learned by Rabbi, he learned by his uncle Reb Chia. He had an uncle Reb Chia from his father's side, his mother's side. He learned by them. And ultimately, he descended to Babylonia, to Bavel. In Bavel lived at the time another great sage who was a little younger than him. His name was Shmuel. Shmuel was the Rosh Yeshiva in a city called Nehardah. The Gemara says about Shmuel that his brilliance was unique. Shmuel said about himself, Nehirinli shvili dirakia kashvili Nehardah. The pathways of heaven are as clear to me as the pathways of Nehardah. He was a tremendous, great astronomer and a great physician and a great scholar, even though he never got smicha. He never got smicha, Shmuel. That's why we call him Shmuel. And Shmuel was the Rosh Yeshiva of Nehardah. Rav didn't want to go to the same place. Rav established a yeshiva in a city called Surah, both on the Euphrates River, on the Har Pros in Iraq. The geography of Iraq is very important for Jewish history, especially for Talmud Bavli. And not only for Talmud, for Parshas Bereshis too. A lot of interesting things happen around Iraq, in Iraq. So he was in Surah, he was in Nehardah. Rav passed away before Shmuel, and they did not stop arguing. Throughout Shas, the two people who argue constantly is Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel. Although they had tremendous respect for each other, to the point that Shmuel said about Rav, the Gemara says, Lo yu'una l'tzadik kalav, and he's a tzaddik, mistakes won't happen to him. When Rav passed away, Shmuel tore his garment 13 times. But nonetheless, their arguments are constant. So the Gemara says in B'chairis, the halacha is like Rav when it comes to Isurim, to mitzvahs between man and Hashem. The halacha is like Shmuel when it comes to monetary issues. Why? So the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, in Masechta Baba Kama tells the reason. Says the Rosh Baba Kama Perek Dalet Siman Dalet, Shmuel hoyaragil tamid lifsik dinin. In Shmuel's Bezdin, he was always involved in giving halachas concerning monetary disputes. So he was very meticulous, he was precise. He had the opportunity to descend into the depths of all the halachas concerned with mammon, with civil law. Rav in his Bezdin, this became the Bezdin that was the best place for Issa v'heter. Rav was completely entrenched in Issa v'heter. So simply, because Rav was so involved in this world, he fine-tuned his skills in this. And Shmuel and Dinei Mamonis. So that's why when the Chazal had to decide, so this is not a blanket statement. You never make a blanket statement in halacha. Every case has to be analyzed independently, right? To the point that the Gemara says in a few places, usually the halacha is like Rav, or the halacha is like Shmuel, the bar mitlas. Besides a few exceptions, we don't go that way. We don't go this way. In other words, we analyze it, but generally there was a rule, unless it was specified, they did analyze every case. But unless it was otherwise specified, this was usually the way that the Batei Dinim, the majority of Chachamim, paskin, and therefore it became the halacha that way, according to the formula that Moshe Rabbeinu gave us of Acharei Rabim le Hatos, or whatever the formula in a specific situation of an argument is. What do we see from here? We see from here that they were really involved. Although, obviously, Shmuel was a great baki in Isser, and Rav was a great baki in Mammon, that goes without saying. But nonetheless, this was his main, as you would say in Yiddish, his main koch. I don't know how you translate koch in English. I can't say his main cooking. But this was where Rav is gelegen, this is where Rav's soul was, where his mind was primarily, and this is where Shmuel's primary mind was. Comes the Rebbe and says, if this is the case, it would seem perhaps that when you study many arguments of Rav and Shmuel, you could see that if there's a choice of explaining the sugya in a way that it will strengthen the relationship in Adam Lamakim, Rav will follow that view. If you can explain it in a way that will strengthen the relationship, not the vertical relationship, but the horizontal relationship between man and man, bein Adam lachavere, man, woman, people, that's where Shmuel is going to embrace it. So in other words, even though we all know, or we should all know, that the Aseres HaDibros, the 10 Commandments, have 5 mitzvahs that relate to bein Adam lamakim, and 5 that relate to bein Adam lachavere, and both were given by Hashem himself. And when somebody chooses this over this, or this over this, it doesn't represent authentic Judaism. The person who's very religious, bein Adam lamakim, when it comes to bein Adam lachavere, is not so. The same Aseres HaDibros says both. And conversely, but Rav nonetheless had a unique kinship with bein Adam lamakim, and Shmuel had a unique kinship with Adam lachavere. So therefore, when there's a choice, his mahalach, his mind, his soul naturally gravitates there. That's who he is. And Shmuel's natural soul gravitates there to bein Adam lachavere. And when you reflect on it, I want to show you a few arguments before we get back to our Rashis that I think you could see this quite clearly. Let's take a look. First of all, 2 statements of Shmuel. The Gemara says in Shabbos, Daf Mem Tesam Mit Beis, Shmuel says, La'olam al yotzi adam esatzmei min haklal. Famous expression of Shmuel. Never exclude yourself from the community, from the klal. Shmuel also says in Chulin Daf Tzadik Dalet, this should be memorized, Asur lignoiv das habriyas afilu dater shel goy. A person is never allowed to deceive somebody else's mind. No difference, a Jew, a non-Jew, to do anything that will fool, trick somebody. Gnevas das doesn't mean you steal something. That he's not talking about. That's for sure. He means Gnevas das means you make a false impression. It's conniving, it's lying. You don't steal anything. But Gnevas das, you want to come eat by my house tonight for Shabbos? I know, of course, that you're going somewhere else. You're going to be out of town. But why not? Already, I can have the cake and eat it too. You could see that I'm a great man. I'm inviting you to my house, and I never have to have you because I know you're not going to be available for Shabbos. That's a classic case that Chazal give for Gnevas das. Let me open the bottle of wine. Azach chashav ha'oirech, like you. Let me open the bottle of wine. Of course, the bottle of wine was either open or you would have opened it even if he wasn't there. You're not harming anything, but it's Gnevas das. It's dishonesty. It's dishonest. So Shmuel says you're not allowed to do this to anybody, not even a Gentile. The Rambam writes in Hilchas Deis, the Kesef Mishnah says, I don't know where the Rambam got it, but we could rely on the Rambam. Rav lo yisach sicha b'teila kol yamav. Usually when you have relationships with people, it's hard, but Rav was a person that in his whole life, lo yisach sicha b'teila, he didn't have a conversation that was idle. With another person. He always retained a sense of seriousness and holiness. I said before, Shmuel said about Rav lo yu'una l'tzadik kol oven. Now, let's see a machloikis in Psachim Daf Kuf Tezayin Amar Aleph. Fascinating Mishnah. We all know the Mishnah. The Mishnah is talking about Pesach. Zog the Mishnah, Maschil begnus u'mesayim b'shvach. When you tell the story of Pesach, you begin with gnus. Gnus means gnus. You begin with disgrace, with shame, and you conclude with praise. Zog the Gemara, Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel have an argument. What does this mean? My begnus. So Rav says, Ki omar betchila oivdei avodah zara hayu aveiseinu. In the beginning, our parents, our forefathers were idol worshippers. Va'achshav kervanu amakam la'avedasu. Shmuel amar avadim hayinu. That's how you begin. We, of course, do both. Right after the Manishtana, we tell our kinderlach, let's start telling you the story. So first we follow Shmuel, we say, Avadim hayinu lefarei b'Mitzrayim, that's the gnus. And the shvach is Hashem took us out. That's going to be the end of the Haggadah. Lefichach anachnu chayavim. Rav says, no, the gnus is not that. The gnus is what? Mitchila oivdei avodah zara hayu aveseinu. What do they have to argue? It says maschil b'gnus. What's the argument? Comes the Netziv. And the Netziv in Meiroi Meisada says, Lo shenechleku b'seder ha'agada, ele nechleku le'eze kavana kiven hatana b'mashakasav b'gnus, iba mesha hayu avodah zara, iba mesha hayu avodim. The Netziv Rabbeinu Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin says they're not actually arguing if it should be in the Haggadah. And perhaps they both said it in their Haggadah. They're arguing what gnus means. When the Tana said maschil b'gnus, what did he mean? What's the argument? So the Maharal says in Gvuras Hashem, Perik Nun Beis, the Maharal says, Av oivdei avodah zara is gnus hanefesh. Avdus is gnus haguf. Somebody can be a slave, but spiritually he's free. Somebody could be an oived avodah zara. Physically he's a free man, but spiritually he's enslaved. Spiritually he's depraved. Morally he's depraved. He's enslaved to a popular culture. He's enslaved to his own addictions. He's enslaved to his own habits. He's enslaved to his own fears. He's enslaved to distorted cultish beliefs. He's a free person. Physically he could move, but internally he's a slave. We all know it can be a much worse kind of slavery. That's what the Maharal says. So fragt the Maharal, upligi eze gnus nechshav gnus yoiser. What's called a greater gnus? L'das Rav gnus hanefesh hu iker. V'lechein maschil b'tchila oivdei avodah zara hayu aveseinu. L'das Shmuel gnus haguf hu iker. V'lechein maschil avodim hayinu. Rav says, gnus hanefesh. Gnus haguf. In many ways you could say, gnus hanefesh, this is man's relationship with Hashem. As a slave, my bein adam lachaveiroi. It's a horrible situation. I'm being oppressed. I'm being abused by another person. The other person has control over me. Shmuel says this is a far greater gnus. Comes the Gemara in Megillah Daf Yud Gimel, and they have an argument on the pasuk. Achashverosh really appreciates Esther. Vayishanev es narisel letoiv beis hanoshim. He does special changes for Esther, positive changes. Zog the Gemara, Rav Amar, Sheshina Oisel Toiv Bazeh She'echila Michael Yehudi. He gave Esther, he allowed her to eat kosher food. Shmuel says, He'echila Kadli de Chazir. What's the Toiv? He gave her, as Rashi says, Chtichois Shuman Chazer, fat pieces of swine. In other words, all the other girls that he had there, he fed them, tuna and sardines, canned gefilte fish. And Esther Amalka, she got to order out every night, or he ordered for her kadle de chazir. There's an argument, Rashi and Tosfos there. Rashi says, and it was an issue of life and death, so she ate it. And Tosfos writes, Chas v'shalom sha'isai chelas. Achashverosh served it. It was there on the plate, but Esther didn't eat it. Asks the Manas Halevi. The Manas Halevi is a great commentator on Megillas Esther, written by the author of Lechadoidi, Reb Shloima Halevi Al-Kabetz from Tzvas, a brother-in-law of the Ramak, Rabbeinu Moshe Cordovero, 16th century Tzvas. He asks, what's the difference? Sagt zeh doirish hatoiv hanafshi b'machalim hamutarim kefi adas v'zeh doirish ha'orei v'hu basar achazir hashamet. Rav, when it says toiv, he right away looks, I would say, bein adam lamakoim, between you and God, what's good? A kosher shtickle lesson. Shmuel is looking, toiv, from a more earthly point of view. You would say, bein adam lachaveda, between man and man. What's pshat? He gave a good meal. When you say, I went to his house, I went to the chasana, oyes given asuda, it means it was a good hechsher. When people say, it was a good meal, bein adam lachaveda, it's referring to delicious, fatty, or as they would say today, unhealthy. In Sanhedrin Daf Tzadik Dalet, Rav and Shmuel argue Vayichad Yisroi. Yisroi comes to visit the Jewish people. Moshe tells them the whole story. Vayichad Yisroi. What's Vayichad Yisroi? Rav Amar Shehevir Cherev Chad al Psaroi. He took a sharp, Vayichad is from the word Chad, Cherev Chad, sharp sword, and he circumcised himself. He converted. Shmuel Amar Shenasa Chidudin Kol Psaroi. His whole flesh began trembling. He got the chills. Chidudin. He got butterflies, so to speak, all over his body. Amar Rav says, explaining Shmuel, Hainu Damri Inchi. This is what people say, Giyura dasara dori lo sevazi arma ba'peh. A convert till 10 generations don't embarrass somebody of his ancestry. Just because he became Jewish doesn't mean you have a right to start speaking about his nation in a disgraceful way, because ultimately these are his biological parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so forth. It's a mistake. Sometimes people marry a spouse, and the spouse gets upset at their parents, and the son-in-law wants to add a little kerosene, so he starts explaining to her even better the nature of her mother or her father, and doesn't realize what a terrible mistake it is, because for you, you're an in-law, and tomorrow you'll be an outlaw. But for her, it's her parents. Even if she's upset, it's her parents. You have to be very careful with these things. And not just careful because the consequences, careful because it's not right, it's insensitive, even if you have a struggle, an issue. But that's a separate subject. But the point is, what's the argument? Vayichad. Rav says, Bein Adam Lamakoim. Vayichad. He had a bris. Shmuel says, no, Vayichad is, he felt bad. You know why? He came from there, and when he heard what happened to the Egyptians, when he heard what happened to Pharaoh, when he heard about the plagues, when he heard about them all drowning, he was taka Jew, and he loved Judaism, and he loved God, and he loved Moshe Rabbeinu, and he loved Tzipora. But Bein Adam Lachavera, he was sensitive. These are his people, and Rav even explains it to Shmuel. So here again we see a similar argument. It's interesting. In Psachim, there's another argument between them. There's a famous argument in Psachim Daf Ayin Vav. We once spoke about it at length. If something non-kosher falls into something kosher falls into something non-kosher pot, so there's an argument between Rav and Shmuel. Rav Amar Ilah Gavar, Shmuel Amar Tata Gavar. What prevails? If the higher piece of meat, the top piece of meat is hot and the lower one is cold, or conversely. Rav says it's determined by the Ilah, by the one on the top. And since heat causes flavor to travel, we know that heat expands the molecules and therefore the flavor travels. So if the higher piece is hot, the whole pot becomes treif. Shmuel says, Tata Gavar, the lower one prevails, and therefore you follow the lower one. If the lower one is hot, then the pot is treif, because we assume that the whole thing became hot and therefore the taste traveled. But if not, if the higher one is hot, according to Shmuel, you have to peel off the place that's touching, but you don't make the whole pot treif if the one on the bottom was cold, and therefore he assumes that case. Rather, the halacha here is like whom? The halacha here is, here you have an example with the halacha in Nisuri is like Shmuel. The halacha in Yeridei and Hilchis Taruvis is Tata Gavar. If you remember before Shavuos, we once explained the whole mahalach of the Balatanya in the Machlokes Ilah Gavar and Tata Gavar. It's not just an argument about meat. It's an argument about two hashkafas. Bein Adam Lamakoim is Ilah. Bein Adam Lachavere is Tata. Bein Adam Lamakoim is you focus on the up higher. Bein Adam Lachavere is not vertical but horizontal. Shmuel says Tata Gavar. You have in the same Masechta Psachim Daf Kuf Dalet an interesting argument about Havdalah. How do you finish the bracha of Havdalah? Rav Amar Mekadesh Yisrael. Shmuel Amar Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'choil. Why is there an argument? Rav says we finish Havdalah Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael. What's the connection to Havdalah? We're not talking about making the Jews holy. We're talking about saying goodbye to Shabbos. Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'choil. That's what Havdalah is. Havdalah is part of the mitzvah of honoring Shabbos, remembering Shabbos. Zachreu b'knisasai u'b'yitziyasai. So Rabbi Yosef Engel has a sefer called Beis HaOitzer, and he quotes from one of the great Kabbalists of Italy, the Rameh Mifanu, Rabbeinu Menachem Azariah Afanu. He quotes Rabbeinu Menachem Azariah Afanu in Shal Tshuvas Harameh, Simin Yud Ches, and this is what he says: Beperek Arvei Psachim Savar Rav Shechoismin Bahavdalah Kol Mitzvah Shabbos Mekadesh Yisrael. The reason is the Kivan the Nafka LaKedushas Shabbos. It's a beautiful interpretation. Because the Kedusha of Shabbos left, loy tisak adaiten the pokel loy Kedusha sayu di Yisrael. Don't think that the Kedusha of the Jewish people also left. So right now, when you're saying goodbye to Shabbos, the Kedusha of Shabbos ceased till next week. We say Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael. The Kedusha of the Jew remains. What's the idea? So Rabbi Yosef Engel explains. Because the Kedusha of the Jew is so intimately connected to Shabbos, so you would think that it's Shabbos that makes the Jew holy. Shabbos is the gift that Hashem gave the Jew to make him holy. So we say, Shabbos is over, aber du bist noch halt Sayyid. Mitzvah Shabbos is, it doesn't mean you have to be a pet Adam. Shabbos is over. Saturday Night Live. Mitagbolos. Shabbos is over, but you're still a Jew. Mekadesh Yisrael. The Jew is still holy. Next Ephon and a Gemara. Nothing will kill you if you open a Gemara Mitzvah Shabbos. So this is Rav's view. Again, Rav believes that the Kedusha of the Jew is deeply connected with Shabbos, which is Hashem's day, and therefore you have to say Mekadesh Yisrael. Shmuel says, I'm focusing on the Havdalah bein Kodesh L'cha. These are perhaps, there's more, but I just chose a few possible examples. This is not what the Rebbe said, but these are a few possible examples to see Rav and Shmuel's view expressing itself this way. In other words, when you have a musig in Yiddishkeit and you could focus primarily bein Adam Lamakim, Rav might go more that way, and Shmuel might gravitate more that way. There's a very geschmacka maisa that brings out the two sides. They say the story, it's a rich and it's a beautiful story. The Rav of Vilna was the legendary Reb Chaim Oizer Gradzensky Zechet Tzadik Livracha, who was considered, he was one of the greatest leaders of Lithuanian Jewry. He was a great askin, a great leader, a great activist, a great gun. He wrote Chalos Chuvas Achiezer. He passed away in Vilna in 1940. Tough shin. He didn't leave any descendants. He had a daughter, but she passed away during his lifetime. So he passed away without children. Reb Chaim Oizer Gradzensky once met another great luminary of Polish Jewry. This was the Ostrovtzer Rebbe, Rabbi Chiel Meir. He was the Rebbe of a city of Ostrovtz in Poland. He had a yeshiva. He was considered one of the Goini Adar, and he was also a Kaddish. He was a holy, a tzaddik. He wouldn't speak a lot. There's Meir Eine Chachamim from the Ostrovtzer. I think the last name was Holstock, right? Chiel Meir Holstock. He passed away 12 years before Reb Chaim Oizer, Tofresh Peches, 1928. The story is that the Ostrovtzer fasted for 40 years. 40 years. He ate at night a little millet, kasha, a little millet with milk. And some say that he had an instinct of a tremendous churban coming. And like the Gemara says about Reb Tzadok in Gittin, that he fasted 40 years before churban Bayesheni. They say the Ostrovtzer fasted 40 years. I once read, I don't know how reliable it is, that he used to do it even on Shabbos. And there was once a guy who had a store open on Shabbos in Ostrovtz, and the Ostrovtzer Rebbe came to him and said, it's Chilul Shabbos, you're not allowed to do this. So he was a chutzpah. He says, Rebbe, is Chilul Shabbos? Shabbos you have to eat. I hear that you fast. So he says, no, there's a big difference. Von mir wird keiner nicht lernen. Von dir wird man sich lernen. Nobody's going to copy my desecration of Shabbos. From you, people might learn. So I guess even according to halacha, the mitzvah is oinik Shabbos. If for somebody fasting is an oinik, okay. But the Ostrovtzer Rebbe just said, for me, nobody's going to learn. So he would not speak a lot. He would not speak a lot. They once asked him, and they say that he said that his father was a baker. His father was a baker. And he grew up, his father was a pashut diyid, a baker. And he said he would sit as a child in the room and he would watch his father turn over the bagels. And his father once turned to him and said, Yechiel man, I want you to remember, as he closed the oven, he says, when the oven is closed and closed tight, the heat gets retained. When the oven is open, you lose the heat. So he took that for a lesson in life. Perhaps I should also. So the Ostrovtzer Rebbe once met Reb Chaim Oizer. They met. So Reb Chaim Oizer asked the Ostrovtzer Rebbe to say Torah. It wasn't his derech, it wasn't his nature, as I told you. He wouldn't speak a lot, so he was hesitant to do that. So Reb Chaim Oizer is saying, they say about you that you're a great man, so why don't you share Torah? So the Ostrovtzer Rebbe says, why do you say that I'm a Gavra Rabbi? I'm a great man. They say you're a great Talmud Chacham, you're a great Torah scholar. So he says, Reb Chaim Oizer, das ist nicht kein Gavra Rabbi. That's not a great man. He says, what do you mean? Reb Chaim Oizer says, I'll tell you. There's a Gemara in Masechta Makkos Daf Chav Beis. I brought here the Gemara so you could see it inside. Makkos Daf Chav Beis, in the middle of the page. The pasuk says in Kiseitze, when you give lashes, you give 40 lashes. But that's not the halacha. The halacha is, we give 39. You're not allowed to give 40. It's an Issam and Atari. You get malchus for that. So the Gemara explains, if it would have said, that the judge gives him 40 in number, havamin arboyim b'minyana. It would mean 40 in number. Hashtag ksiv b'misper arboyim. But since it says kedei rishasa yakena b'misper arboyim, minyan shu soikim as arboyim. But misper arboyim means in the number that leads up to 40. In other words, 39. Amarava kama tipshoi sharinchi the kaimi mekame sefer Torah v'loy kaimi mekame gavre Rabbi dilu b'sefer Torah ksiv arboyim v'asur rabbanon batzru chada. How foolish are the people? They stand up when a sefer Torah comes in, but they don't stand up in front of a great man who is even greater, because the sefer Torah says give him 40 lashes, and the rabbis say give him 39, and we accept that as halacha. So how could you not stand up when a gavre Rabbi comes in? Turns the Strafza turns to Reb Chaim Oizer. He says, Reb Chaim Oizer, I don't understand. Rav found one example from Parshas Ki Zeitzei where the sages give explanation to the Torah. You have it throughout the whole Torah. Take already Parshas Boy, the mitzvah of tefillin. It says in Torah, "V'hoyu l'toitofos beinei necha," it should be between your eyes. But we know orally it means top of the head. Kshartem lo'isal yadecha means not on your hand. It means so over there you could say it's halacha l'mayit shemisina. He says, but we have an example that's identical to this. We're Parshas Emer. It says, Tispiru chamishim yoim. You should count 50 days between Pesach and Shavuos. How many days do we count? 49. The rabbis took off one day, and there's a whole discussion in Gemara about it, in Masechta Menachos. Kasav echadayim sheva shabbos, kasav echadayim chamishim yoim. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, it was a whole debate, and they proved that it means 49 days. And this is where in Parshas Emer. So why does Rav have to wait to Parshas Ki Zeitzei and prove the greatness of the Talmud Chacham, the greatness of the Chachmei HaMesorah, the greatness of Chazal, and how foolish people are not standing up and respecting them? You have it already in Parshas Emer? No, he waits to Parshas Ki Zeitzei, where from 40 lashes they made 39. So the Strafza Rebbe tells Reb Chaim Oizer, I'll explain to you. Rav is using the word Gavre Rabba, great man. He says, you know what a great man is? A great man, a Gavre Rabba, is not somebody who can say pshat, that even though the pasuk says 50, really it means 49. A Gavre Rabba is emitzer. Emitzer. Was nimmt up ein Klapp von Aiden. Somebody who sees that a Jew might be lashed 40 times, and he proves and he demonstrates and removes one lash from a Jew, das is a Gavre Rabba. That's a great person. Das is a Gavre Rabba. That's a great person. Chaim Oizer, he loved the word. He said, das is Chassidus. Chaim Oizer was a big Litvak. He said, das is Chassidus. He appreciated the word. So we have Ben Adam LaMakom, we have Ben Adam LaChaveirah. You have the Gavre Rabba, in Ben Adam LaMakom, you have the Gavre Rabba in Ben Adam LaChaveirah. Now, let's come back to Melech Chadash. Melech Chadash. Rashi, in 3 places, brings Rav and Shmuel. Not in any other places. Why? Because Rashi feels that to understand the nature of the argument between them, why would they argue? You have to know the names Rav and Shmuel. By Melech Chadash, by Yosef, and by Avram Avinu, by the Esha. There's an advantage in each interpretation. That's why he has to bring both. He wouldn't bring both if he felt one was pshat and the other one is not pshat. This is pshat and this is pshat. He brings one first, but he also brings the second one because the first one has problems. And yet, in order to explain to you the meaning of the argument, the nature of the argument, the reason for the argument, he brings the names, because without the names there would be no way of understanding it. What are the names? Rav and Shmuel, Vayakam Melech Chadash. Let's understand. Why does the pasuk even say all of this? The pasuk is trying to tell a story. The Jews settled in Mitzrayim. Yosef passed away. A new king arose. He didn't know Yosef. However, we explain the new king. And he tells his nation, let's be clever. Why let us be clever? Because they made the clear war against us. They will become our enemies. V'nilcham banu v'olam min ha'aretz. And as a result of that, vayasimu alav sarei misim, they begin to oppress the Jewish people. Now let's understand this for a moment. Was this serious? Or was this puricious? Logically, was there a real concern for this? I don't understand. Pare. You turn to your people and you tell them we have a new threat in our country, the Jews. Why? They have been killing people? No. They have been stabbing people in the streets? No. They have been doing suicide bombs? No. They have been blowing themselves up? No. What's the reason? The reason is pen, yirb. They may grow, and there may be a war, and they may join our enemies, and they will help them drive us out of the land. But 1 second. You have been with them for many years. You have been with them for many years. You saw what their leader Yosef did for your country. You saw that they were loyal citizens. And not only that, they're grateful to you because Egypt ultimately became a safe haven for them. It fed them, it nurtured them, it gave them a place to settle in Goshen. And the nature of a functional, normal person is you don't pay back a toiva with a row. Somebody who saves my life, I don't go. And when there's a war, I fight you. We see already clearly in Pshat, Avram and Avimelech. Avimelech asks Avram, and it's obvious, you have to swear to me that for generations, none of your descendants will ever harm because I did with you a toiva. Already in the times of Avram. It's an obvious idea, even by the Gentile. Comes Pharaoh and says, no. They're going to declare war and destroy us. Why? What? So you have to assume this is what's called rishus. It's called rishus. It's not a fear that's really justified because the Jews have proven to be disobedient, disloyal, criminals, rebels, trying to make a mutiny, Bolsheviks who are trying to revolt and overthrow the empire. It's pure rishus. It's pure rishus. Now the question is, okay, rishus. But what type of rishus? Is it a rishus? Is it a wickedness bein adam la'makayim? Or is it a wickedness bein adam la'chaverei? What type of rishus? Is it a wickedness between man and God? My moral responsibilities to the creator of the world to moral justice? Or is it primarily a wickedness between man and man? So Rav and Shmuel see the pasuk. Rav naturally gravitates. When you want to bring out rishus, what's the worst rishus? Bein adam la'makayim. Shmuel says you want to bring out wickedness. What's the worst wickedness? Bein adam la'chaverei, between man and man. This is where he gravitates naturally. Therefore, this is what Rav sees in the pasuk, Melech Chadash. Shmuel sees something else in the pasuk. Each one has a problem, true, but the other one also has a problem. So why am I choosing this? You're choosing this? This is his soul, and this is a reflection of his soul. So now let's ask a question. If you say that his main rishus was bein adam la'chaverei, the main rishus is between man and man, where would that be stronger? If he was a new king, a new kid on the block, or he was the old king? Where would the rishus bein adam la'chaverei? Obviously the old king, because the old king was saved by Yosef. Literally, his whole empire was rescued by Yosef. He saved the situation from doomsday. There would have been a hunger that devastated the world and would have devastated Egypt completely. Even that which they stored away rotted, as Rashi says. And here is the man who single-handedly saved the superpower of the time. And these are his children and his grandchildren. How could you be such a kafli toiva? How could you be so ungrateful? Unless you're a Rasha Marusha, unless you're cruel, your bein adam la'chaverei is so damaged, that's on that level. If you say he was a new king, this doesn't mean he was a tzaddik bein adam la'chaverei. You have to respect Egyptian history. But the rishus is not the same. I never knew Yosef. I never got anything from Yosef. I never had a relationship with Yosef. He never saved my country. That's bein adam la'chaverei. If you look at the bein adam la'makayim, it's the other way around. Why is it the other way around? Because let's think about it. If he was an old king, then he has an excuse to God. He says, 1 second. I'm the one who made Yosef prime minister. I told him, you're under my jurisdiction. Rak hakisei egdal mimeka. The throne remains greater than you. His family decided to move to Egypt, and that means they accepted to be under my rulership, my yoke. Perhaps they were forced, they needed food, but they moved to Egypt. You moved to my country, you accept on yourself to become my subject. Yaakov Avinu, their patriarch, came into me. He gave me kavod hamalchus, as Rashi says, glory of a king. He blessed me when he came in, he blessed me when he went out. He gave me honor as a king. Therefore, according to his mindset, he has an amasla, he has an excuse. That Meshamayim from heaven, bein adam la'makayim, I have a right. Now I'm changing my policy. I'm changing my policy. On the other hand, if you say he was a new king, completely a new king, the Jewish people never came into Egypt to accept his rulership, to accept him as a monarch. He never made a deal with Yosef. Yaakov never accepted him as a king. They were living there already when he became a new king. Who gave you a right to change the policy and suddenly turn free people into slaves? Why are you suddenly making new decrees against them? Why? Bein Adam Lachaveirei, maybe it's not so bad. You never knew Yosef, you never had a relationship with him. But Bein Adam Lamakim, morally speaking, what's your excuse? Who gave you a right? So you say, I'm taking over the previous king, and he had a right to control the Jews because they accepted his leadership. But one second, he never did this. Why are you doing this? Hence, Rav says, what's Melech? Melech is Melech Chodosh. Shmuel says, what's Melech Chodosh? Shmuel looks at Rishis, Bein Adam Lachaveirei is much worse. So therefore, if it's Mamash a new king, Bein Adam Lachaveirei, he wasn't so bad. I mean, he was pretty bad, but not the worst. He never knew Yosef. So what does Shmuel say? He knew Yosef. He made himself like he didn't know Yosef. Bein Adam Lachaveirei, it's a crime. Rav says, a deeper wickedness is Bein Adam Lamakim, Halacha Rav Beisur v'Chishmol Bedini. So Rav says, it says Chodosh. Chodosh means new, and it works for me new. You know why? Because if it's new, Bein Adam Lamakim, he's a great criminal. Bein Adam Lachaveirei, his criminal record is a little less than by Shmuel. So Rashi brings the name Rav and Shmuel here because this follows their shitta. Now come to the next Rashi. The next Rashi is Yosef HaTzadik. Vayavei habayis elasis malachtoi. Yosef comes home to do his work. The pasuk obviously is telling us about the righteousness of Yosef HaTzadik. That's the story here. He came home, he runs away from her, he's accused of doing a horrible thing, and he gets thrown into prison. Rav and Shmuel argue. Rav says, what's the greatest tzaddik? Who's the greatest tzaddik? Bein Adam Lamakim. So what does malachtoi mean? Malachtoi mamish. He came home to do his work. Say that he came home to do what the wife of Potiphar wanted. This would be, as Yosef himself said, v'chatosi le'elokim. It would be a terrible crime against God, besides against Potiphar, because she was a married woman. So Rav, who sees the great tzaddik as being Bein Adam Lamakim, he says, what does it mean? Vayavei habayis elasis malachtoi? Literally, Malachta, he came home to do his work. Never would I think that he came home to surrender to the wish of the wife of Potiphar. Rav demonstrates the righteousness of Yosef in terms of the relationship between man and Hashem. Shmuel comes along and says, one second, take a look at the pasuk. Whenever Shmuel has a chance to accentuate, to bring out the tzitkus bein adam lachaveiroi, that's what he's going to bring out. So that's what he does here. Nobody is in the house. Why is the pasuk mentioning that? So if you say Rav and Shmuel follow the above this difference I said, Rav follows always the literal wording, and Shmuel follows context. We can understand it on one level. Rav says malachta means work. Malachta doesn't mean relationship. Shmuel says you're right. Malachta means work, but put it in the context of the story. Why would Yosef go into the house when nobody was there when he knew what the wife of Potiphar wanted? Why? The words you're right, but give me the context. The context. Why would he do that? So Shmuel says I have to say lasas trachav. Or Shmuel will put it, let's put it in a different way. It says, Vayavai habayis lasas malachtoi, ve'ein ish me'an she'abayis sham babayis. What's the connection? He came home to do his work and nobody is home. How do you understand the context of the pasuk? So Shmuel says it had to be a type of malacha that if somebody is home, he can't do it. So Shmuel says, lasas trachav. That's if we explain that l'shitasi. But now let's go bein adam lamakim, bein adam lachaveir. Rav says tzitkas bein adam lamakim. So what does malachta mean? He would never engage in such a thing. Shmuel says the Torah is bringing out the tzitkus bein adam lachaveir, not bein adam lamakim, and therefore the Torah says vayavei habayis elasis malachtei when ve'ein inch me'anshe habayis. He was a servant of Potiphar. In that sense, he had an obligation bein adam lachaveir to his master, and he was loyal. He was very loyal. Vayifkedeu al beisoi. He was in charge on the house. How can he engage in something else? Ve'ein inch me'anshe habayis. There was nobody home then. So therefore his job as a servant of Potiphar at that moment was suspended. There's nobody home. So in terms of Ben Adam Lachaveiroi, it brings out his righteousness, his loyalty to Potiphar in the sense that he would not violate his duty as a servant, because Vayifkedeu al Beisei, by right now he's not subject, he's not committed to Potiphar. He has nothing what to do with Potiphar for Potiphar because there's nobody home. What does it bring out? It brings out the sensitivity, the tzitkus of Yosef ben Adam Lachaveiroi. So Shmuel says, Lasas Shrachav. This is the only time he would do Lasas Shrachav. And yet, of course, he abstained when he saw the image of Yaakov, his father. Obviously, that the pasuk says they both agree on. Come now to Avram Avinu Vayita Eshel Bever Sheva. He plants an Eshel. Rav says he plants a garden. Shmuel says he builds a hotel. Why would they argue? Again, why would they argue? So you could look at it again in terms of word and context. The word Vayita Eshel means he planted. What do you plant? You plant a garden. But Shmuel says, look in context. Context, what are you trying to do? You want to publicize God. How will you publicize God more? Through a garden and through a hotel? Obviously through a hotel. You have rooms, you have programs, you have Shabbatons, you do seminars, you give shiurim, and you bring fruits, you bring food. It's a whole matzav. So I understand. Shmuel follows context, Rav follows words. And we're not getting into it today, but there's a whole shitasi of Rav and Shmuel on this level throughout Shas. Words versus context. But now let's talk about Ben Adam Lamaka, Ben Adam Lachaveiroi. In terms of Ben Adam Lachaveiroi, where are you doing a greater favor, service for people? Planting a garden or building a hotel? Planting a garden is a wonderful thing, but building a community center is a far greater service Ben Adam Lachaveiroi. You'll bring them fruits, you'll bring them other foods, you'll service them in many other ways. So Shmuel says, what's Vayita Eshel? He planted a hotel. But Rav says, one second, I'm always searching for the Ben Adam Lamakay. And here's the question. When I build a hotel, I build a hotel. When I plant a garden, what happens? What do I have now? When I plant a garden, I have meiser. When I plant a garden, I have meiser. Vayitin loy meiser mikoil. To whom? Meiser is to Hashem. To the kohen, to those who serve Hashem. When I make a garden, what does it say? Even by Kayin. Vayove, right? Vayove Kayin. Minchel Hashem from what? From his new fruits. Even Kayin understood that. A hotel, you can't do that. You built a hotel, beautiful, you're serving people. So Rav always looks to see. There's a special emphasis also on Bein Adam Lamakay. So Rashi here also quotes Rav and Shmuel, because Rav and Shmuel give explanation and insight to the reason they would argue. Yes, there's an advantage in this perspective, there's an advantage in this one, but why would they argue in these three cases? Rashi feels you can understand the nature of the argument and what would cause you to go here, what would cause you to go here, and the advantage in each. And that's why in these three places he quotes the name. In conclusion, what we also learn from here is, on a more general and historical point of view, is that very often in the world of politics and in the world, a new leader arises. Now is a very hot season of deciding who is going to be the new leader, who should be the new leader. A new leader arises. So Rashi is telling us here, of course, based on the Gemara Neivin and Masechta Saita. He said, no difference if it's a Melech Chadash, or no difference if it's a Melech Sheneschatshuk Zeirosav and it's not a Melech Chadash. Sometimes people think a new leader means everything of the past is erased and a whole new beginning emerges. And sometimes people think a new leader could be very, very dangerous. An old leader, if you get him to change the attitude, is much better. So Rashi tells us here, as long as he's a Melech Mitzrayim Miloshen Meitzar, somebody who oppresses truth, who oppresses godliness, who oppresses Yiddishkeit, who oppresses the Holy Land. So no difference if it's a Melech Chodosh, if it's a new king, or it's an old king, Sheneschatshuk Zeirosav. If it's a Melech Mitzrayim, then don't be deluded and don't be deceived that you don't have to stand guard and you don't have to be careful Because Melech Mitzrayim could come in many different types of guises. Could be a new person with a new promise, with a new message, with a new perspective. But yet, ultimately, it's Hava Nischak Maloi. Or it could be an old person who says, Nischachuk Zeiros, of new things will happen. But it could be the same Melech Mitzrayim. What you do need is, you need B'yaldois HaIvriyos. You need Yiddish Mamas. You need Yiddish Tatas. That when the Melech Mitzrayim says, take your children and throw them in Haya'oira. Throw them in, what's Ya'oira? Throw them into the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim. The Nile was the idolatry of Mitzrayim. That's what they worshipped because it was the source of their livelihood. When the king of Mitzrayim says, take your children and throw them into the God of Mitzrayim. Throw them into the deities of Mitzrayim. V'chol habas techayim. And even the daughters, make sure you give them life according to what Egypt calls life. So you have miyaldois ha'ivriyos. You have Jewish mothers who don't listen to Parei Melech Mitzrayim and raise a generation that's not entrenched in the Nile and the idolatry of Egypt. And then you have a Moshe Rabbeinu who comes to the king with a Matei HaElokim. He respects a king. A king you respect, but he comes with a stick, and with a stick of God, meaning he comes with confidence. He comes with Jewish pride. He comes with a sense of dignity that comes from Hashem. Matei Elokim b'yadai. Rashi says he respects Paroi, but he comes to Paroi with a Matei Elokim. He comes as a servant, as a citizen of Egypt to the king. But how does he come? He comes with a stick of God, Matei Elokim, not apologetic, not embarrassed, not ashamed, not lame, not meek. He has a divine stick in his hand, so he's respectful. He follows the laws of nature when you have to follow the laws of nature. He knows how to be diplomatic when you have to be diplomatic. But Matei Elokim b'yadai. He's not ashamed. He's not embarrassed to speak the truth. He's not embarrassed to say who he is and what his land is and what God is. And he could say, Shalach esami v'yavduni. That's the ultimate eitzah against all the types of Paris Melech Mitzrayim, whether it's a new kid on the block, whether it's an old kid on the block who changes his colors, but that's the ultimate solution of the Jewish people against Pari and all of his guises. Have a wonderful week.